Coming up, yes, you heard that correctly. You could actually have a President Nancy Pelosi. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, first of all, let me apologize if my voice isn't quite what it usually is, because I'm not recording this early afternoon as I usually am. We have a hurricane coming in, and even though it's only supposed to skirt the coast, I am in South Florida, and based on the possibility that we could lose power, I decided to go ahead and record this in the wee hours of the morning, about 3:30 in the morning to be exact, before the winds start kicking up. So if my voice sounds a bit scratchy, that's why. So now on to the first segment. Just in case you're in the mood for a stress-inducing thought, I was playing around with the electoral map at 270towin.com, and I was reminded of something that I've thought about before, but I think I just pushed it out of my head because it was just too stress-inducing. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the possibility that the 2020 election could result in an electoral college tie. I'll explain this to you in a minute, but the circumstances that would result in a tie aren't exactly bizarre. In fact, it would be a relatively mundane series of wins and losses in the states. Let me explain. If Joe Biden wins Pennsylvania, Michigan, and the 2nd Congressional District in Maine, and other than those, President Trump takes the states he won in 2016, each candidate would have 269 votes, one short of the number needed to win. So what on earth happens then? The election goes to Congress. Okay. That doesn't seem that complicated, but you're probably wondering, does it go to the House? Because the Democrats control the House. Actually, it doesn't go to the current Congress. It goes to the newly elected Congress. So you're probably thinking, okay, whoever wins the House of Representatives in that circumstance gets the presidency. Not exactly. The election of the president in the event of an electoral college tie goes to the newly seated House of Representatives, but not on a one-vote per congressperson basis. Instead, each state gets a single vote, and the members of Congress from that state vote to determine what that single vote will be. So you might be thinking, well, even though Democrats currently control the House of Representatives, Republicans might have more individual states where they have the majority of the congresspersons from that state. And you'd be right. So how big is the Republican advantage in state congressional delegation majorities? Republicans hold 26 of the 50 state congressional delegations. That's right, the exact number of votes needed to elect the president in the House of Representatives in the event of an electoral college tie. And that's what Republicans hold currently. Republicans cannot afford to lose the majority in a single congressional delegation and still expect to win the presidency through the House of Representatives in the event of an electoral college tie. And by the way, if because of an even split in the delegation, a state congressional delegation is evenly split on the vote for president, their vote is considered undecided. Therefore, it doesn't count towards the 26 votes needed to elect the president. So what happens if nobody gets 26 votes by the January 20 deadline? Hold that thought. You might be wondering whether the vice president is elected the same way in the event of an electoral college tie. No, that would be far too simple. The vice president is selected by the Senate. Once again, the newly seated Senate, not the current Senate. And senators would each get one vote. Currently, Republicans hold 53 Senate seats, so if that number holds in the election, it's 2 more than they need to win a vice presidential election in the Senate in the event of an electoral college tie. If, on the other hand, Republicans lost 2 Senate seats in the election, Democrats voting with the 2 independents in Congress would have enough votes to create a tie in the Senate. If Republicans lost 3 seats, the Democrats would have enough to win a vice presidential election in the Senate created by an electoral college tie. So what happens in the event of a tie in the vice presidential election held in the Senate? Well, they just keep voting. And what happens if they don't pick a VP by the January 20 deadline? Hold that thought. Let me digress for just a moment. Have you thought about the bizarre circumstances that this process could create? You could have a president and a vice president from different parties. Think about this possibility. Donald Trump is elected president by the House of Representatives after Republicans maintain control of 26 state congressional delegations in the election, but Democrats win 3 Senate seats and elect as vice president the vice presidential nominee who was on the ticket with Joe Biden. Think about that. Perhaps President Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. What if extreme leftist Congresswoman Karen Bass from California is Joe Biden's running mate and she becomes a vice president under President Trump? Or Elizabeth Warren becomes vice president? Now think about what happens if Democrats control the House of Representatives. Remember, Republicans could still control 26 House congressional delegations, but not control the House majority because Republicans control more states with smaller populations. Democrats in the House impeached President Trump in his first term, even though if by some miracle they thought they could get the 2/3 vote required in the Senate to remove him, they would still be left with a President Pence. Now think about whether they would find some excuse to impeach if they could fantasize about a 2/3 vote in the Senate to remove him where he would be replaced by a Democrat. Imagine how loudly activist Democrats would be screaming for impeachment. Imagine how destabilizing it would be to have a Republican president and a Democrat vice president. Think about the Hollywood movies you've seen where the vice president is scheming to take over and he's in the same party as the president. What about if the situation is flipped? What if Republicans lose control of 1 or 2 House delegations? If they lose 1, they can't get the 26 needed to elect the president. If they lose 2, leaving the Democrats controlling 26, then the Democrats could elect the president in the event of an electoral college tie. And if the Republicans hold the Senate, you could have a President Biden and a Vice President Pence. We've heard plenty of criticism that Joe Biden is losing his mental faculties, and a fair amount of that criticism has come from me. But what if we had a President Biden and a Vice President Pence? Now think about how much criticism you'd hear from the right and from political commentators on Fox that Joe Biden has lost his faculties, that he must step down. It would be a constant refrain. So I've asked you to hold that thought twice. Once for what happens if there aren't 26 votes in the House of Representatives for the president, and once for what happens if the Senate can't elect a vice president by the January 20 deadline. Well, in that scenario where the House of Representatives can't find 26 votes for Donald Trump or Joe Biden, or technically a third candidate if a third one receives at least 1 electoral vote, then from January 20 until the House manages to find 26 votes for one of those candidates, the vice president-elect chosen by the Senate becomes president. Now think about the scenarios I presented earlier. You could have a Vice President-elect Mike Pence become president until the situation is resolved. Okay. You could have a Vice President-elect Kamala Harris become president. Really? You could have a Vice President-elect Karen Bass become president. Oh my God. I told you this was going to be stress-inducing, so let's add to the stress. It's unclear whether VP Mike Pence can use his tie-breaking power as president of the Senate to break a tie vote for vice president in the Senate in the event of an electoral college tie. So you can expect that question to end up in the Supreme Court if it happened. Now wrap your head around this. In the event of an electoral college tie, if the House can't find 26 votes for the president by January 20, and the Senate can't find 51 votes for the vice president by January 20, then the Speaker of the House becomes president until either the House elects a president or the Senate elects a vice president. Yes, you heard that correctly. You could actually have a President Nancy Pelosi. Stress-inducing indeed. Next topic. U.S. news versus Iranian news. A shocking realization came to me recently. I can remember having the same thought many times over the years whenever I saw a foreign cultural or political piece on TV news about a country with an authoritarian government. The one that comes to mind immediately is Iran. On multiple occasions, I've watched TV news coverage of developments in Iran that would show Iranians sitting at a table, sipping tea or coffee and reading the newspaper. And the thought that I had every time is, what's the point? What's the point of reading a newspaper in a country where the news is false? What does an Iranian citizen do when he reads the newspaper? Does he accept the stories and spins at face value? Does he assume that there's some underlying truth in the news about something that happened and it's only the explanation as to why which is false? Does he try to figure out what truth may be getting past government censors? Does he analyze each story, try to figure out the incentives, both in the form of encouragement to tell falsehoods and penalties for failing to do so, and then try to figure out what is true, what is false, what's been exaggerated, and what's been deliberately downplayed? Every time I'd always think, what a pain, why bother? When you know the papers won't or can't print the truth, why bother reading them? Well, it's probably occurred to you now what the shocking realization was that struck me recently. It was that journalism in America has descended to the point that the same questions that I asked myself about Iranian citizens reading the paper in Iran could be asked about American citizens reading and watching the news in America. Every story you read, every broadcast you watch, every news video you watch online, you have to ask yourself a series of questions and then go on a hunting expedition for alternative explanations and the facts which may have been ignored, exaggerated, or downplayed. And you can't just stop at looking for alternative explanations for the story you read. You have to go hunting for all the stories which weren't available, which might put the story that you read in perspective. Think about the subjects I've covered in prior podcast episodes. For example, where I found absurdly biased coverage of a shooting by police in Pittsburgh after the jury acquitted the police officer. The New York Times and NBC News chose to tell you virtually nothing other than that the jury acquitted the police officer and to describe the career goals of the unarmed 17-year-old African-American that was killed, Antoine Rose Jr. Then when I went digging, I found actual legitimate journalistic coverage of the acquittal by CBS News and, to my astonishment, CNN. Those two outlets revealed the fact that the young man who the police shot had been in the car involved in a drive-by shooting earlier, just a mile and a half away, before exiting the vehicle involved in that shooting and fleeing from police when they pulled the car over, because it matched the description of and was, in fact, the car involved in the shooting. CNN also revealed that the car had a shattered rear window and was, quote, riddled with bullet holes, close quote. Those two outlets also revealed that there was a gun under the seat in which Antoine Rose was sitting in the car, that there was some evidence indicating that the shot came from that part of the car and that he had gunpowder residue on his hands. Incredibly, the New York Times and NBC News revealed none of that info in their story about the acquittal of the police officer charged with killing Antoine Rose Jr. So as I think about that story and as I realize that 2 of the 4 sources that I went to did an abysmal job of covering the acquittal by excluding the multiple facts which undermined the narrative that the jury had reached an unjust decision in acquitting the police officer and had done so for racial reasons, and 2 of the 4 outlets did a reasonably good journalistic job of covering it, and one of those outlets, CNN, is one that I regularly chastise for their near abandonment of journalistic standards, I realize there's a reason to be both encouraged and discouraged. If a citizen of Iran looked only to media sources in Iran, the likelihood of getting at the truth probably borders on non-existent if the truth doesn't match the government story. In America, with some digging, sometimes just to multiple major outlets, as I did with the stories regarding the death of Antoine Rose Jr., and sometimes to all sorts of media outlets, both right-leaning and left-leaning, and often focusing on local media, where the story originates rather than just the national news, you can usually get to the truth, or at least your best estimate as to the truth based on common sense and what you've been able to dig up. I suppose you can say that's somewhat encouraging, but who the hell has that much time? And why on earth should we have to go through that? And when, oh when, will we see journalists, ethical journalists, stand up and scream, stop with the endless focus on the narrative, stop with acting as political activists rather than reporters, stop with the over-the-top, endless anti-Trump bias? Journalism was an honorable profession. There are some who practice it honorably, but they are far too few in number. And as I wait and pray, perhaps futilely, for the honorable among them to stand up and shout for it to become an honorable profession again, I realize that if it doesn't, we'll all reach the point where there really won't be a difference between us and that Iranian citizen sitting in a cafe in Iran, sipping coffee or tea and reading the newspaper filled with lies, falsehoods, and misinformation. Next topic. Stress reliever. Okay, you deserve a break from the stress. You deserve a little bit of good news. The polls are creeping back slightly away from Biden and towards Trump. But Biden still has a lead. It's still significant in multiple swing states, but those enormous Biden leads we've been seeing in some swing state polls are becoming less and less common. Now, we've covered the problems with the polls recently, so I don't want to dive into them in detail. I want this to be a very, very brief topic. You've heard me say before that in 2016, one of the most reliable polls, actually the second most reliable major poll, was Rasmussen Reports. You've seen much of the media criticize Rasmussen for polling that tends to be more favorable to Republicans than other polls. I even recently read an article ranking the quality of various polls which gave Rasmussen a C+ without explanation. It amazes me that a polling outfit can nail an election that so many others got wrong, and then 4 years later, everybody forgets about it and acts as if that outfit has a less than stellar record. Well, I don't forget, and I constantly look at Rasmussen Reports. So what is Rasmussen saying now? On Friday, July 31, Rasmussen Reports' daily presidential tracking poll shows that 50% of likely U.S. voters approve of President Trump's job performance and 48% disapprove. That's the highest approval he's had this year and matches the highest he had in 2019. Don't count on hearing much about that on CNN. But you know where you will hear it? Where you'll continue to hear news and commentary even if it doesn't fit the media narrative? Right here on Political Spirits each and every week. Be sure to join me. And be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits. And follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell and select all, after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.